James Callahan's fingers trembled as he held the cream-colored envelope, its gold embossing, catching the late afternoon light that filtered through his corner office. The weight of it felt like lead, far heavier than mere cardstock should. Boo! He knew what lay inside, an invitation to celebrate his and Eliza's 15th wedding anniversary at the Monarch Hotel, an extravagant affair that his wife had been planning for months. "Mr. Callahan," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 4 o'clock is here." James cleared his throat. "Give me 5 minutes, Sarah." He slid his finger under the flap, breaking the seal. The invitation was everything he expected: elegant, tasteful, and utterly suffocating. As he read the flowing script, a wave of emotion washed over him: guilt, fear, and a gnawing sense of impending doom. 15 years, a decade and a half of building a life together, climbing the social ladder of Chicago's elite, and creating a facade so perfect that sometimes even James believed in it. But beneath the polished surface lurked a truth that threatened to shatter everything they'd worked for. His eyes darted to the framed photo on his desk. He and Eliza, on their wedding day, young and full of hope. Her smile was radiant, his eyes full of promise. When had things changed? When had he started to feel trapped by the very life he'd once dreamed of? The buzz of his cell phone pulled him from his reverie. A text from Natalie. "Can we meet? Tonight, I miss you." James's heart raced as he quickly typed back, "Can't tonight. Work dinner. Tomorrow." He slipped the phone into his pocket, guilt gnawing at him. How had he ended up here, leading a double life, lying to everyone he cared about? Taking a deep breath, James straightened his tie and stood. As he moved towards the door, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. At 42, he still cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, but there were new lines around his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. He wondered if others could see it too, the weight of his secrets, the strain of living a lie. "Send him in, Sarah," James called, plastering on the confident smile that had become second nature. As his client entered, James slipped effortlessly into his role as the successful lawyer and devoted husband. But inside, a storm was brewing, fueled by the knowledge that in just a few short weeks, everything could change. The meeting dragged on, the client droning about contract stipulations while James's mind wandered to the looming anniversary party. He nodded at appropriate intervals, years of practice allowing him to feign attention while his thoughts raced. Finally, as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, James found himself alone in his office once more. He loosened his tie, feeling as though he could barely breathe. The invitation on his desk seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, a harbinger of change. His phone buzzed again, Eliza this time. "Don't forget, dinner with the Whitmores at 8. Wear the blue tie I got you for Christmas." James texted back a quick affirmative, then slumped in his chair. Another evening of small talk and forced smiles, of pretending to be the perfect couple. He was exhausted just thinking about it. As he gathered his things to leave, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. The invitation in his briefcase was more than just a summons to a party. It was a countdown to a moment of truth that had been years in the making. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt interminable. James nodded to colleagues, exchanged pleasantries with the building security guard, all while feeling as though he might shatter at any moment. In the privacy of his car, he allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, taking deep breaths. The weight of his deceptions pressed down on him, making it hard to think clearly. "Pull yourself together," he muttered, sitting up straight. He had a role to play, a performance to give, and for now at least, the show must go on. As he navigated the busy Chicago streets, James's mind wandered to Natalie. Her youth, her passion, the way she made him feel alive again. But then Eliza's face swam into view. Her unwavering support, her grace, the life they'd built. Together, how had he managed to entangle himself so thoroughly? The Whitmore's house loomed ahead, a monument to old money and new ambitions. James parked, took one last deep breath, and stepped out of the car. As he walked to the front door, he straightened his blue tie, the one Eliza had chosen, and prepared to step back into the role of James Callahan, devoted husband and pillar of the community. But with each step, the invitation in his briefcase felt heavier, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Eliza Callahan stood in front of her full-length mirror, scrutinizing her reflection with a critical eye. The black cocktail dress hugged her curves perfectly, a testament to hours spent at the gym and carefully monitored meals. At 40, she was still strikingly beautiful, her dark hair swept into an elegant updo, her makeup flawless. But as she leaned closer to the mirror, she noticed something that made her frown, a small wrinkle at the corner of her eye that hadn't been there before. Eliza sighed, reaching for her concealer. In her world, imperfections were unacceptable. "Honey, are you ready?" James's voice called from downstairs. "We'll be late for the Whitmores." "Just a minute," Eliza called back, her voice light and controlled. She took one last look in the mirror, plastered on her perfect smile, and headed downstairs. James was waiting by the door, looking handsome in his suit. Eliza felt a flutter in her chest. Even after 15 years, he still had that effect on her. But lately, something felt off. There was a distance between them that she couldn't quite put her finger on. "You look beautiful," James said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Eliza noticed he was wearing the tie she'd given him for Christmas. It was a small thing, but it made her smile. "Thank you. Shall we?" The drive to the Whitmores was quiet, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of marriage. But underneath, Eliza felt a current of tension. She glanced at James, noting the tight set of his jaw, the way his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "You seem stressed." James startled slightly, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Just work stuff," he said, flashing her a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Big case coming up." Eliza nodded, not entirely convinced. She wanted to press further, but they were pulling up to the Whitmores' mansion. The moment had passed. The party was in full swing when they arrived, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilling out onto the driveway. Eliza slipped her hand into James's, putting on her society smile as they walked in. James, Eliza, Margaret Whitmore swooped down on them, air-kissing Eliza's cheeks. "So glad you could make it. You both look fabulous, as always." Eliza felt James tense beside her at Margaret's effusive greeting. She squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of support, before launching into small talk with their hostess. As the evening wore on, Eliza found herself watching James more closely. He was charming as always, working the room with ease, but there was something off about his smile, a tightness around his eyes that she'd never noticed before. "Eliza, darling." Caroline, her best friend, appeared at her elbow with a fresh glass of champagne. "You look a million miles away. Everything okay?" Eliza took the offered glass, grateful for the distraction. "Just tired," she lied smoothly. "We've been busy planning the anniversary party." Caroline's eyes lit up. "Oh, I can't wait. It's going to be the event of the season. 15 years. You and James are such an inspiration." Eliza smiled, the praise sitting uncomfortably in her stomach. An inspiration. If Caroline only knew the doubts that had been creeping into her mind lately. Across the room, she saw James deep in conversation with David, his law partner. There was an intensity to their discussion that made Eliza curious. She excused herself from Caroline and drifted closer, catching snippets of their conversation. "Can't keep this up forever, James," David was saying, his voice low but urgent. "The firm's reputation—" James cut him off, noticing Eliza's approach. "We'll discuss this later," he said firmly, then turned to his wife with a smile that seemed forced. "Having fun, honey?" Eliza nodded, her mind racing. What was James keeping from her? What couldn't he keep up forever? The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk and forced laughter. By the time they made it home, Eliza felt exhausted, and not just from the socializing. As she removed her jewelry in front of her vanity, she watched James in the mirror. He was loosening his tie, his movements mechanical, his eyes distant. "James," she said softly, turning to face him, "is there something you want to tell me?" He froze for a moment, then continued undressing as if he hadn't heard her. "What do you mean?" Eliza took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I overheard you talking to David. It sounded serious. Is everything okay at the firm?" James's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might actually open up to her. But then he straightened, his lawyer's mask slipping back into place. "It's nothing for you to worry about," he said, his tone dismissive. "Just some difficult clients. You know how it is." Eliza nodded, swallowing her disappointment. "Of course. Well, if you want to talk about it," but James was already heading for the bathroom, effectively ending the conversation. Eliza turned back to her mirror, studying her reflection. The woman who looked back at her seemed like a stranger, perfect on the outside, but inside, a growing sense of unease was taking root. As she crawled into bed that night, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The cracks in their perfect life were starting to show, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could ignore them. Next to her, James was already asleep, or pretending to be. Eliza stared at the ceiling, her mind whirling with questions she was afraid to ask. Whatever was going on, she had a sinking feeling that their upcoming anniversary party might bring it all to the surface. The weeks leading up to the anniversary party flew by in a whirlwind of preparations and mounting tension. Eliza threw herself into the planning with a fervor that bordered on obsession, meticulously overseeing every detail from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the carefully curated playlist. One afternoon, as she sat at the dining room table surrounded by seating charts and vendor contracts, Eliza heard the front door open. James was home early, a rarity these days. "In here," she called out, not looking up from her work. James appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and jacket slung over his arm. "Hey," he said, his voice weary. "How's it going?" Eliza finally looked up, taking in his disheveled appearance. "Fine. Just finalizing some details for the party. Are you okay? You look exhausted." James ran a hand through his hair, mussing it further. "Long day. The Morton case is taking up most of my time." Eliza nodded, a familiar pang of disappointment settling in her chest. Once upon a time, James would have shared the details of his cases with her, bouncing ideas off her legal mind. Now, it felt like pulling teeth just to get a simple update. "Well, I could use your input on the seating arrangements," she said, gesturing to the charts spread out before her. "I'm having trouble with table 8. James glanced at the papers, his eyes glazing over. "I'm sure whatever you decide will be fine. You know this stuff better than I do." Eliza bit back a retort. Of course she knew it better. She was the one putting in all the effort. "James, this is our anniversary party. Don't you want to be involved at all?" He had the grace to look sheepish. "Of course I do. I'm sorry, I'm just distracted. Work stuff." "It's always work stuff lately," Eliza muttered, turning back to her charts. James hesitated, then moved to stand behind her chair. He placed his hands on her shoulders, squeezing gently. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice softer. "I know I haven't been very present lately. This party means a lot to you, and I promise I'll be more involved." Eliza leaned back into his touch, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. "It's not just about the party, James. It's about us. Sometimes I feel like we're drifting apart, and I don't know how to fix it." James's hands stilled on her shoulders. For a moment, Eliza thought he might open up, might finally tell her what was really going on, but then he stepped back, the moment lost. "We're fine," he said, his tone reassuring but hollow. "Just busy. Once this case is over and..." The party's done. Things will get back to normal. Eliza nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As James left the room, muttering something about a shower, she turned back to her seating charts, but the names and tables blurred before her eyes as she blinked back tears. What had happened to them? When had they stopped being partners and started being strangers living parallel lives? The next day, Eliza met her friend Caroline for lunch at their favorite bistro. As they settled into their usual table, Caroline eyed Eliza with concern. "Okay, spill," she said, forgoing pleasantries. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Eliza sighed, toying with her water glass. "Is it that obvious?" Caroline reached across the table, squeezing her friend's hand. "To me it is. What's going on? Is it the party stress?" "Partly," Eliza admitted. "But it's more than that. It's James." Caroline's eyebrows shot up. "Trouble in paradise? I thought you two were rock solid." Eliza laughed bitterly. "So did I. But lately, it feels like we're living separate. He's always working, always distracted. And when he's home, it's like he's not really there. Have you talked to him about it?" "I've tried, but he just brushes it off, says everything's fine." Eliza took a sip of water, trying to steady her voice. "I'm scared, Caroline. I feel like I'm losing him, and I don't know why." Caroline was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful. "You don't think there's someone else, do you?" The question hit Eliza like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on work stress, on the possibility of financial troubles, that she hadn't even considered. "No," she said firmly, more to convince herself than Caroline. "James wouldn't. He's not that kind of man." But even as she said the words, a seed of doubt took root in her mind. The late nights at the office, the distracted behavior, the emotional distance. Suddenly, it all took on a sinister new meaning. Caroline, seeing the panic in her friends, Isa backpedaled quickly. "I'm sure it's nothing like that. Look, the anniversary party is in a few weeks. It'll be a chance for you two to reconnect, to remember why you fell in love in the first place." Eliza nodded, forcing a smile. "You're right. I'm probably just overthinking things." But as they moved on to lighter topics, Eliza couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that had taken hold. She found herself replaying every interaction with James over the past few months, searching for clues she might have missed. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Eliza heard James come home. She listened as he moved through the house, his footsteps pausing in the study before heading upstairs. The shower turned on, and Eliza's mind raced. Why did he always shower as soon as he got home now? Was he washing away evidence of something, someone? She shook her head, trying to dispel the toxic thoughts. This wasn't her. She and James had built a life together, a partnership based on trust and mutual respect. She couldn't let unfounded suspicions destroy that. But as she called James down to dinner, Eliza couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted. The shadows of doubt had crept in, and she wasn't sure their perfect facade could withstand the strain much longer. The pediatric ward of Chicago Memorial Hospital was always a hive of activity, but today seemed particularly chaotic. Dr. Natalie Chen weaved through the crowded hallway, her white coat fluttering behind her as she rushed to her next appointment. "Dr. Chen," a nurse called out, jogging to catch up with her. "Mr. Callahan is here for the board meeting. He was asking about the new child psychology program you proposed." Natalie felt her heart skip a beat at the mention of James's name. "Thanks, Amy. I'll be there in a few minutes." As she hurried towards the conference room, Natalie tried to calm her racing pulse. It had been weeks since she'd seen James outside of these formal settings, and the forced professionalism was starting to wear on her. She paused outside the door, taking a deep breath and smoothing her hair. It was ridiculous, she knew, to be so affected by a married man. But James Callahan had a way of making her feel alive in a way no one else ever had. Plastering on her most professional smile, Natalie entered the room. James was there, looking impeccable in a charcoal suit, deep in conversation with the hospital's chief of staff. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, their eyes meeting across the room. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away. Then James broke eye contact, turning back to his conversation. Natalie felt the loss like a physical ache. The meeting dragged on, full of budget discussions and policy debates. Natalie found it hard to focus, hyper-aware of James's presence just a few seats away. When it was her turn to present her proposal for expanding the child psychology department, she stumbled over her words, feeling like a flustered intern rather than a respected doctor. "So thank you, Dr. Chen," the board chairman said when she finished. "It's an interesting proposal. Mr. Callahan, as our liaison to major donors, what are your thoughts?" James leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I think it has potential. The need is certainly there, and I believe we could drum up significant support for such a program. I'd like to discuss the details further with Dr. Chen, if that's all right." Natalie's heart raced at his words. A chance to be alone with James, even under the guise of work, was more than she dared hope for. As the meeting adjourned, James approached her. "Do you have time to go over your proposal now?" he asked, his voice low. Natalie nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They walked together to her office, the silence between them charged with unspoken tension. Once inside, with the door safely closed, James's professional demeanor crumbled. He pulled Natalie into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "God, I've missed you," he murmured. Natalie melted into his embrace, all her doubts and guilt momentarily forgotten. "I've missed you too. These past few weeks have been torture." James pulled back slightly, his eyes searching her face. "I know, I'm sorry, things have been complicated." Natalie felt a pang of guilt at the mention of complications. She knew she was the complication, the other woman, and the threat to his perfect marriage and carefully constructed life. "James," she said softly, stepping out of his arms. "We need to talk about this, about us. What are we doing?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture Natalie had come to recognize as a sign of his inner turmoil. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know that when I'm with you, I feel alive, like the person I used to be, before all the pressure and expectations." Natalie's heart ached at his words. She understood all too well the suffocating weight of others' expectations. It was part of what had drawn her to James in the first place, the sense that he saw her, really saw her, not just as Dr. Chen, the rising star of pediatric psychology, but as Natalie, the woman with dreams and fears and a passionate heart. "But you're married," she said, voicing the elephant in the room, "to a woman you've built a life with for 15 years. I can't. It won't be the reason that falls apart." James moved closer, cupping her face in his hands. "Eliza and I, it's not what it seems. We've been going through the motions for years. This perfect life we've created, it's all a facade." Natalie wanted to believe him, wanted to lose herself in the fantasy of a future with James. But the rational part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through medical school and her grueling residency, wouldn't let her. "James," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands, "I care about you. More than I should, more than is safe for either of us, but this, whatever this is between us, it can't continue. Not like this." She saw the pain in his eyes, felt it echoed in her own heart, but she held firm. James nodded slowly, his hands falling to his sides. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know you're right, I don't know how to let you go." Natalie felt tears pricking at her eyes. "We have to," she whispered, "for both our sakes." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of their impossible situation hanging heavy between them. Finally, James straightened, his lawyer's mask slipping back into place. "We should discuss your proposal," he said, his tone professional once more. Natalie nodded, grateful for the return to safer ground. As they pored over her plans for the expanded psychology department, she tried to ignore the ache in her chest, the sense of loss that threatened to overwhelm her. When James finally left her office an hour later, Natalie sank into her chair, emotionally exhausted. She had done the right thing, she knew. But if that was true, why did it feel like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life? As she turned back to her work, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of medical jargon and treatment plans, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Something was building, a storm on the horizon that threatened to upend all their lives. She just hoped they would all still be standing when it passed. The day of the anniversary party dawned bright and clear, a perfect Chicago summer day. But for James Callahan, it felt like the calm before a storm. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his bow tie, he couldn't shake the sense of impending doom that had been growing for weeks. "James," Eliza's voice called from the bathroom. "Can you zip me up?" He turned to see his wife emerging, resplendent in a silver gown that hugged her curves. For a moment, James was transported back 15 years to their wedding day. Eliza had taken his breath away then, and she still had the power to do so now. But the guilt that churned in his stomach tainted the moment. "You look beautiful," he said softly, moving to help her with the zipper. Eliza met his eyes in the mirror, a flicker of something. Hope, uncertainty, crossing her face. "Thank you. You're not so bad yourself." As James's fingers brushed the nape of her neck, he felt her shiver slightly. He wanted to say something, to bridge the gulf that had grown between them, but the words stuck in his throat. The moment passed. Eliza turned away, reaching for her jewelry. "The car will be here in 20 minutes. Are you ready?" James nodded, swallowing hard. Ready or not, this night would change everything. Across town, Natalie Chen stood in front of her own mirror, second-guessing her decision for the 100th time. The invitation to the Callahans' anniversary party sat on her dresser, a constant reminder of the complicated web she had entangled herself in. She shouldn't go. She knew that. But the thought of James celebrating 15 years with Eliza, playing the role of devoted husband, made her heart ache. Before she could talk herself out of it, Natalie grabbed her purse and headed out. The door. The Monarch Hotel was a vision of old-world glamour, its grand ballroom transformed into a glittering wonderland for the night's celebration. As James and Eliza made their entrance, a hush fell over the crowd, followed by appreciative murmurs and applause. "They look perfect together," someone whispered, loud enough for James to hear. The words were like a knife to his gut. For the next hour, James played his part flawlessly. He smiled for photos, made small talk with Eliza's colleagues, and raised his glass in countless toasts to their marriage. But inside, he was unraveling. His eyes kept darting to the entrance, both dreading and hoping to see Natalie walk in. He knew she had received an invitation, a gesture from Eliza, who knew her as the doctor spearheading the new pediatric psychology program James had championed. The irony was almost too much to bear. "James." Eliza's voice cut through. His thoughts. "Are you okay? You seem distracted." He turned to his wife, plastering on a smile, just taking it all in. "You've outdone yourself with this party." Eliza beamed, but James could see the uncertainty lingering in her eyes. Before she could press further, they were interrupted by the arrival of David, James's law partner. "James, Eliza, congratulations," David boomed, clapping James on the back. But as he leaned in for Eliza's cheek kiss, he whispered in James's ear, "We need to talk now." Excusing themselves, James followed David to a quiet corner of the ballroom. "What's going on?" he asked, dread pooling in his stomach. David's face was grim. "The Morton case. The opposition's found something. If this gets out, James, it's not just the case we'll lose. The firm's reputation." James felt the blood drain from his face. The Morton case, his biggest ever. The one he had poured his heart and soul into for months. The one that had served as his alibi for so many late nights away from home. "How bad is it?" he managed to ask. David opened his mouth to respond, but his eyes widened, focusing on something over James's shoulder. James, isn't that the doctor from the hospital board? What's she doing here?" James spun around, his heart stopping as he saw Natalie enter the ballroom. She was a vision in deep blue, her dark hair swept up elegantly. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, the world fell away. Then reality came crashing back as Eliza appeared at his side. "Oh, Dr. Chen made it. I wasn't sure. She'd be able to come. Isn't it nice to have some of the hospital staff here, James, given how much time you spend there for the board?" James felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Eliza's hand was on his arm. David was urgently trying to continue their conversation, and Natalie was making her way across the room towards them. In that moment, James Callahan realized that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eliza Callahan prided herself on her ability to read people. Years of legal training and navigating. Chicago's high society had honed her skills to a fine point, so when she saw the look that passed between her husband and Dr. Natalie Chen, she felt as though she had been plunged into ice water. It lasted only a second, a fleeting glance across a crowded room. But in that moment, Eliza saw everything she had been afraid to acknowledge for months. "James," she said, her voice tight, "why don't you introduce me properly to Dr. Chen? I feel like we've never had the chance to really talk." James startled, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Of course," he said, his lawyer's mask slipping back into place. "David, we'll finish our discussion later." David nodded, shooting James a warning look before melting back into the crowd. Eliza filed the interaction away for later. Examination. Right now, she had a more pressing concern. As Natalie reached them, Eliza plastered on her most charming smile. "Dr. Chen, I'm so glad you could make it. I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Eliza Callahan." Natalie shook her offered hand, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Please, call me Natalie. Thank you for inviting me. You've put together a beautiful celebration." 15 years, Eliza said, her arm snaking possessively around James's waist. "It's quite a milestone, isn't it?" She felt James stiffen beside her but ignored it, keeping her eyes locked on Natalie. The younger woman's composure slipped for just a moment, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "Yes, it certainly is," Natalie replied. "You must be very proud." The conversation continued, a dance of double meanings and veiled emotions. Eliza watched as James and Natalie tried to maintain a facade of casual acquaintance, but she saw the way their eyes kept meeting. The slight tremor in Natalie's hand as she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. As the trio stood there, locked in their own private drama amidst the swirling party, Eliza felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. The suspicions and fears that had been gnawing at her for months suddenly crystallized into cold, hard certainty. Her husband was in love with another woman. The realization should have devastated her. Instead, Eliza felt oddly detached, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. "And the new pediatric psychology program is really taking shape," Natalie was saying, her professional enthusiasm breaking through the tension. "Thanks in large part to James's support on the board." "Oh yes," Eliza said, her voice honey-sweet. "James has been spending so much time at the hospital lately. All those late-night meetings and weekend calls. It's a wonder I see him at all these days." She felt James flinch and saw Natalie's eyes widen in panic. "Got you," Eliza thought, a grim satisfaction settling in her chest. Before either of them could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Eliza turned to see David arguing with a man she didn't recognize, sharply dressed, but with a hungry look in his eyes that screamed journalist. "I need to deal with this," James muttered, already moving away. "Excuse me." As he strode towards the developing scene, Eliza and Natalie were left alone, the air between them charged with unspoken accusations. "Eliza," Natalie began, her voice low and urgent. I don't. Eliza cut her off, her tone glacial. Not here, not now. This is my anniversary party, Dr. Chen. I would hate for anything to disrupt it. Natalie blanched, nodding quickly before melting into the crowd. Eliza watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. Anger, yes. Pain, certainly. But underneath it all, a steely determination was taking root. She moved through the party with practiced grace, smiling and chatting as if her world hadn't just been turned upside down. But her mind was racing, piecing together months of clues she had willfully ignored. The late nights at the office, the distracted behavior, the way James's eyes would light up at mentions of the hospital, of the pediatric ward. God, had he really been so obvious? Had she been so blind? As she accepted congratulations and fielded questions about the secret to a happy marriage, Eliza felt like screaming. 15 years of partnership, of building a life together, and for what? To be humiliated in front of all their friends and colleagues. She spotted James across the room, deep in conversation with David and the unknown man. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw. Whatever was happening, it was serious, good, a vindictive. Part of her thought, let him squirm. But as the night wore on and the champagne flowed freely, Eliza felt her anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. This party, this celebration of their life together, it was all a sham, a beautiful, glittering lie. As the band struck up a slow song, couples began to fill the dance floor. Eliza stood at the edge, watching as friends and colleagues swayed to the music, lost in their own private worlds. Mrs. Callahan, a tentative voice broke through her reverie. She turned to see a young waiter looking nervous. Your husband asked me to give you this. He handed her a folded note before quickly disappearing back into the crowd. With trembling hands, Eliza opened it. Meet me in the Winter Garden. We need to talk. Eliza stared at the words, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her spine and smoothed her dress. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity. She was Eliza Callahan. After all, and she'd be damned if she let anyone see her fall apart. With one last look at the glittering ballroom, the celebration of a marriage that now lay in ruins, Eliza turned and made her way towards the Winter Garden. And whatever reckoning awaited her there. The Monarch Hotel's Winter Garden was a stark contrast to the glittering ballroom Eliza had just left. Here, the air was cool and fragrant with the scent of exotic flowers. The soft trickle of a small fountain provided a soothing counterpoint to the muffled sounds of the party beyond. Eliza's heels clicked against the stone pathway as she made her way deeper into the garden. She spotted James near a large orchid display, his back to her, shoulders hunched as if carrying an immense weight. James, she said softly, announcing her presence. He turned, and Eliza was struck by how tired he looked, how much older than his 42 years. The mask of the successful, confident lawyer had slipped away, leaving behind a man she barely recognized. Eliza, he breathed, relief and dread mingling in his voice. Thank you for coming. She didn't respond, simply arching an eyebrow and waiting. Let him squirm, she thought. Let him try to explain away the betrayal she had witnessed with her own eyes. James ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she had once found endearing. Now it just irritated her. I don't know where to begin, he said. How about the truth, Eliza suggested, her voice sharp. For once in your life, James, just tell me the truth. He flinched at her tone but nodded. You're right. You deserve that much. He took a deep breath. I've been having an affair with Natalie, Dr. Chen. Even though she had known, hearing him say the words out loud felt like a physical blow. Eliza steadied herself against a nearby planter, the cool stone grounding her. How long? She managed to ask. 6 months, James admitted, unable to meet her eyes. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of sneaking around behind her back. Eliza felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat and ruthlessly suppressed it. "Why?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "What did I do wrong?" James's head snapped up. "No, Eliza, no, you didn't do anything wrong. This is all on me. I got lost somewhere along the way. The pressure at work, the constant need to maintain our image. I felt like I was suffocating. Natalie. She reminded me of who I used to be, before all of this." Eliza absorbed his words, each one another crack in the foundation of their life together. "And so what, James? I'm just part of the problem, part of the gilded cage you built for yourself." "That's not what I meant," he started, but Eliza cut him off. "Do you love her?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 15 years of shared history and shattered trust. James opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I don't know," he finally said. "I care for her. But Eliza, you have to believe me, I never stopped loving you." Eliza laughed then, a bitter sound that seemed to echo through the garden. "Love? You don't even know what that word means anymore, James. If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied to me for months. You wouldn't have made me question my own sanity when I sensed something was wrong." She turned away from him, needing a moment to compose herself. The garden suddenly felt stifling, the perfume of the flowers, cloying and overwhelming. "There's more," James said quietly behind her. Eliza whirled back to face him. "More? What else could there possibly be?" James's face was ashen. "The Morton case. There are some irregularities. If it gets out, the firm could be in serious trouble. My career." "Your career," Eliza repeated flatly. "That's what you're worried about right now. Your career." "Eliza, please," James pleaded. "Don't I know I've made a mess of everything, but if we could just present a united front for a little while longer." "No." The word came out sharp, decisive. "No, James. I will not be your shield. I will not stand by your side and pretend that everything is fine while you try to salvage your precious reputation." She saw the panic in his eyes, the desperation. For a moment, Eliza felt a perverse satisfaction in his distress. Let him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused her. "What are you saying?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza straightened her spine, lifting her chin. In that moment, she felt every inch the formidable lawyer she had once been, before she had set aside her own ambitions to support James's career. "I'm saying it's over, James. Our marriage, this charade we've been living, it's done. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between them, irrevocable and final. James staggered back as if she had physically struck him. "Eliza, you please," he begged. "We can work through this. 15 years. 15 years of what, James?" she interrupted. "Of building a life on lies, of me slowly losing myself to be the perfect wife for your perfect image." She shook her head. "No, I deserve better than that. I deserve better than you." Before James could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. They turned to see Natalie Chen hesitantly entering the garden, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. James. That reporter is asking more questions. David sent me to find you." Eliza looked from Natalie to James and back again. In that moment, seeing them together, any lingering doubt she might have had evaporated. "Well," she said, her voice cold, "I suppose the gang's all here." "How convenient." "Eliza," James started, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "No, James, I think we're done here." She turned to Natalie. "He's all yours, Dr. Chen. I hope you're prepared for what that really means." With that, Eliza turned on her heel and walked out of the garden, head held high. She could hear James calling after her, but she didn't look back. As she re-entered the ballroom, the sounds of celebration washing over her, Eliza Callahan made a silent vow to herself. This was not the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The days following the anniversary party passed in a blur for all involved. For Eliza, the world had taken on a surreal quality, as if she were moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She had returned to the party after her confrontation with James, plastering on a smile and making excuses for his absence. A work emergency, she'd told curious guests, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. She'd played the role of gracious hostess for another hour before quietly slipping away, leaving the remains of her shattered marriage behind in the glittering ballroom. Now, sitting in her home office surrounded by legal documents, Eliza felt a strange mix of numbness and determination. She had already contacted her old friend Sandra, a cutthroat divorce attorney known for her handling of high-profile splits. "We need to move fast," Sandra had advised during their initial consultation. Before James has a chance to hide assets or spin the narrative, Eliza had nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. She might have set aside her legal career to support James, but she hadn't forgotten her training. She would not be the victim in this story. Across town, James Callahan was facing his own reckoning. The law firm's conference room felt more like an interrogation chamber as he sat across from his partners, trying to explain the mess he'd made of the Morton case. "Oh Jesus, James," David exclaimed, running a hand over his face. "How could you miss this? The opposition is going to have a field day." James stared at the document spread before him, the damning evidence of his negligence. He had been so distracted by his personal life, so caught up in the affair with Natalie, that he'd missed crucial details that could now sink not just the case, but potentially the entire firm. "I'll fix it," he said, his voice hollow even. To his own ears, "Then I'll find a way to make this right." The senior partner, a man who had been a mentor to James for years, shook his head sadly. "I'm not sure you can, son. The reporter at your party, he's already sniffing around. If this gets out..." The unspoken threat hung in the air. James nodded, understanding all too well. His career, the reputation he'd spent years building, was hanging by a thread. As the meeting adjourned, James pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over Natalie's number. He needed to talk to someone, to feel a connection that wasn't tainted by disappointment or judgment. But before he could make the call, a text from Eliza flashed across his screen. "My lawyer will be contacting you. Don't try to hide anything. It will only make things worse." James felt the last shreds of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Meanwhile, at Chicago Memorial Hospital, Natalie Chen was facing her own professional crisis. She sat in the chief of staff's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "Dr. Chen," the chief began, his tone grave, "I'm sure you understand the seriousness of this situation. Your involvement with Mr. Callahan has put the hospital in a very difficult position." Natalie nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand, sir. I want to assure you that my personal life has never affected my work or my commitment to my patients." The chief sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Be that as it may, the optics of this situation are problematic. The board is concerned about potential lawsuits, about the impact on our fundraising efforts." "What are you saying?" Natalie asked, though she already knew the answer. "We think it would be best if you took a leave of absence," the chief said, not unkindly. "You do. So give things a chance to blow over. We can reassess the situation in a few months." Natalie felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She had known there would be consequences, but the reality of it, the potential end of a career she had worked so hard for, was overwhelming. As she left the chief's office, Natalie found herself wandering to the pediatric ward. She paused outside the playroom, watching as children, some bald from chemo, others hooked up to IV poles, laughed and played. This was why she had become a doctor. This was what really mattered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from James. "We need to talk. Can you meet?" Natalie stared at the message, tears pricking at her eyes. She thought of the children in the playroom, of the life she had built for herself here, and she thought of James, the connection they shared, the way he made her feel alive. But at what cost? Taking a deep breath, Natalie made a decision. She typed out a response. "I'm sorry, James, I can't do this anymore. Please don't contact me again." As she hit send, Natalie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. Back at the Callahan home, Eliza sat in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, surrounded by photos and mementos of her life with James. 15 years of memories, of shared dreams and accomplishments. She had thought they were building something unbreakable. How naive she had been. As she sifted through the remnants of her marriage, Eliza felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. The life she had built. With James was over, yes. But maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to rediscover the woman she had been before. The ambitious lawyer, the passionate advocate, the person she had set aside to be Mrs. James Callahan. Setting down her wine glass, Eliza reached for her laptop. It was time to update her resume, time to reclaim her own story. As night fell over Chicago, 3 lives that had once been intertwined now spun off in separate directions. The glittering facade had shattered, leaving behind raw truths and uncertain futures. But in the aftermath of destruction, there was also the potential for rebirth. For James, Eliza, and Natalie, the real journey was just beginning. 3 months after the fateful anniversary party, Eliza Callahan stood in front of her full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the perfectly coiffed society wife with her designer dresses and carefully cultivated image. In her place stood a woman with shorter, edgier hair, wearing a crisp pantsuit that spoke of confidence and ambition. "You've got this," she told her reflection, straightening her jacket. Today was her first day back in a courtroom in over a decade. After weeks of networking and brushing up on recent case law, Eliza had secured a position with a small but respected firm, specializing in civil rights cases. It was a far cry from the corporate law world she had left behind. But that was exactly the point. As she gathered her briefcase and headed out the door of her new, much more modest apartment, Eliza felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. But underneath the anxiety was a current of excitement she hadn't felt in years. The courthouse steps were familiar yet foreign as Eliza climbed them. She paused at the top, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. This was where she belonged, where she should have been all along. Eliza Callahan. She turned to see a vaguely familiar face, Mark Reynolds, a lawyer she had known in her early career days. He was looking at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Mark, hello," she said, smiling warmly. "It's been a long time." "It certainly has," he replied, falling into step beside her as they entered the building. "I heard you. We're getting back into the game, but I hardly believed it. The famous Mrs. Callahan, returning to the trenches." Eliza felt a flicker of irritation at the title but pushed it aside. "It's just Ms. Harrison now," she corrected gently, using her maiden name. "And yes, I decided it was time to get back to what I love." Mark nodded, looking slightly abashed. "Well, I have to say you look great. Rejuvenated somehow." "Thank you," Eliza said, meaning it. "I feel rejuvenated." As they parted ways, Eliza couldn't help but reflect on the changes of the past few months. The divorce proceedings were ongoing, messy and contentious as she had expected. James was fighting her at every turn, desperate to protect his assets and what was left of his reputation. But Eliza was done being the supportive wife, done sacrificing her own dreams for the sake of his ambitions. With each passing day, she felt more like her old self, the ambitious, passionate woman who had once dreamed of changing the world through the law. Her first case was a small one, representing a group of tenants fighting against a slumlord. But to Eliza, it felt monumental. As she stood before the judge, presenting her arguments with a clarity and conviction that surprised even herself, she felt truly alive for the first time in years. Across town, James Callahan sat in his office at the law firm, staring at the cardboard box on his desk. After weeks of damage control and desperate maneuvering, the partners had made their decision. He wasn't being fired outright, a small mercy given his years with the firm, but he was being pushed into early retirement. "It's for the best, James," David had said, not unkindly. "Give things a chance to blow over. In a year or two, who knows, you might be able to reinvent yourself." Reinvent himself. The words echoed in James's mind as he slowly packed up his personal belongings. Photos of his children from his first marriage, now grown and distant, awards, and accolades that suddenly seemed hollow. And buried at the bottom of a drawer, a small velvet box containing the watch Eliza had given him on their 10th anniversary. James picked up the box, turning it over in his hands. He thought of Eliza, not the hurt and anger of their last encounter, but the bright-eyed young woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. He had lost her long before the affair, he realized. Perhaps he had never truly had her at all. With a heavy sigh, James placed the watch in the cardboard box. It was time to face the truth he had been avoiding for months. He had destroyed everything he had worked for, hurt the people he cared about most. And for what? A brief escape from the pressures of the life he had built for himself. As he stepped out of the elevator for the last time, carrying the box of his former life, James felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in decades, he had no idea what came next. Meanwhile, in a small town in Michigan, Natalie Chen was rediscovering the simple pleasures of a life unburdened by ambition and secrets. After resigning from her position at Chicago Memorial, she had moved back to her hometown, taking a job at the local community health clinic. Today, she sat across from Mrs. Halverson, an elderly patient struggling with depression after the loss of her husband. As Natalie listened, offering gentle guidance and support, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing in her high-flying Chicago career. "Thank you, Dr. Chen," Mrs. Halverson said as their session ended. "I don't know what I'd do without these talks." Natalie smiled warmly, squeezing the older woman's hand. "That's what I'm here for, Mrs. Halverson. Same time next week." As she watched her patient leave, Natalie's phone buzzed with a text. For a moment, her heart leapt, thinking it might be James, but it was from her mother. "Dinner at 6? Dad's making your favorite." Natalie felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The pain of ending things with James still lingered, but it was overshadowed by the peace she had found here. The simple rhythms of small-town life, the connections with patients and neighbors, the chance to rebuild her relationship with her parents, all of it felt like a gift she had never known she needed. As the day drew to a close, Eliza, James, and Natalie each found themselves standing at the threshold of new beginnings. The glittering life they had once been entangled in was behind them, its false promises and hollow achievements laid bare. But in its place, something new was emerging, something real, something true to who they really were. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was their own. 6 months after the dissolution of the Callahan marriage, Chicago was in the grip of an unseasonably warm spring. The city seemed to be shaking off the last vestiges of winter, much as its inhabitants were emerging from the cocoon of a scandal that had rocked its elite social circles. Eliza Harrison, née Callahan, hurried down Michigan Avenue, her mind buzzing with preparations for her upcoming case. She had just left a meeting with a potential key witness and was so lost in thought that she almost collided with a man exiting a coffee shop. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I wasn't looking where—" Eliza's apology died on her lips as she recognized the man. James, her ex-husband, stood before her, looking simultaneously familiar and strange. Gone was the perfectly tailored suit and the air of confident superiority. Instead, James wore casual slacks and a button-down shirt, his hair slightly longer than she remembered. But it was the look in his eyes that truly caught her off guard, a mix of humility and quiet determination that she had never seen before. "Eliza," James said, his voice soft with surprise. You look great." for a moment. They stood there awkwardly, the bustling street fading into background noise. Eliza felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, but also a strange sense of curiosity. The man before her seemed so different from the James she had known. "Thank you," she finally managed. "You look different." James chuckled. Ruefully, "I feel different." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you have a minute? Maybe we could grab a coffee?" Eliza's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from any further pain. But something in James's demeanor made her pause. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Okay, but just for a few minutes." They found a small table in the corner of the coffee shop. As they settled in with their drinks, Eliza took a moment to really look at her ex-husband. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, but there was also a calmness to him that she didn't remember. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "how have you been?" James took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Honestly, it's been the hardest 6 months of my life, but also, maybe the most important." He went on to explain how, after leaving the law firm, he had hit rock bottom. The loss of his career, his marriage, and his reputation had sent him into a tailspin. "I finally had to face who I really was," he said quietly, "and I didn't like what I saw." Eliza listened, surprised by her own lack of anger. She had spent months furious at James, but seeing him now, she felt something closer to pity. "So what did you do?" she asked. "I got help," James admitted. "Therapy, support groups. I've been volunteering at a legal aid clinic, trying to remember why I became a lawyer in the first place." He looked at her directly. "Eliza, I know it doesn't change anything, but I am so sorry for what I did to you, to us." Eliza felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them away. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "It doesn't fix things, you're right, but it helps to hear it." They talked for a while longer, catching each other up on their lives. Eliza told him about her new job, the challenges and rewards of getting back into the courtroom. James listened with genuine interest, and Eliza was struck by how different this conversation felt from any they'd had in the later years of their marriage. As they prepared to leave, James hesitated. "Eliza, I know I have no right to ask, but do you think we could try to be friends? Not now, maybe, but someday." Eliza considered his words carefully. The anger and hurt were still there, but they had dulled over time. And the man sitting across from her now seemed so far removed from the one who had betrayed her. "I don't know, James," she said honestly, "but I'm glad we had this talk. Maybe we can start with that." As they parted ways on the sidewalk, Eliza felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The encounter hadn't erased the past, but it had given her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Natalie Chen was facing an unexpected encounter of her own. She had just finished her shift at the community clinic when she saw a familiar face in the waiting room. Dr. Patel, her former mentor from Chicago Memorial. "Dr. Patel," she said, shock evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" The older doctor smiled warmly. "Natalie, it's good to see you. I was hoping we might talk." They ended up at a small diner down the street, Natalie still reeling from the surprise visit. "I don't understand," she said as they settled into a booth. "Did you come all this way just to see me?" Dr. Patel nodded. "I did." "Natalie, the work you were doing in pediatric psychology, it was groundbreaking. We've been struggling to fill the gap you left." Natalie felt a pang of guilt, remembering the abrupt way she had left Chicago. "I'm sorry," she began. But Dr. Patel held up a hand. "No apologies necessary. I understand why you left, but I'm here because I have a proposition for you." He went on to explain that the hospital was launching a new telemedicine program aimed at providing mental health support to children in underserved rural areas. "We need someone to head up the program," he said. "Someone with your expertise and passion. You could do it from here." Build a team of your own. Natalie sat back, stunned. It was an incredible opportunity, a chance to make a real difference on a larger scale. But it also meant reconnecting with the world she had fled, facing the ghosts of her past. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Can I think about it? Dr. Patel smiled kindly. Of course. Take all the time you need. As she watched her former mentor leave, Natalie felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The life she had built here in her hometown was safe, comfortable, but was it enough? That night, as Eliza, James, and Natalie each reflected on their unexpected encounters, they found themselves standing once again at a crossroads. The paths they had chosen in the wake of the scandal had led them to places of healing and self-discovery. But now, new opportunities and challenges loomed on the horizon. The question that hung in the air for each of them was the same. Were they ready to take another leap into the unknown? The Chicago summer was in full swing, the city pulsing with energy as people flocked to street festivals and lakefront beaches. But for Eliza Harrison, the sunny days were mostly spent in the cool confines of her law office or the austere halls of the courthouse. Today, she stood before Judge Harriet Watkins, presenting her closing arguments in a case that had consumed her for months. It was a class action lawsuit against a major corporation accused of dumping toxic waste in low-income neighborhoods. Your Honor, Eliza said, her voice strong and clear, the evidence presented leaves no doubt. The defendant knowingly and willfully endangered the lives of thousands of citizens, all in the name of profit. We ask the court to hold them accountable and to send a message that no company, no matter how powerful, is above the law. As she took her seat, Eliza caught the eye of her lead plaintiff, a mother whose child had developed leukemia. The woman gave her a small, hopeful smile, and Eliza felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Hours later, as she left the courthouse, Eliza's phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Drinks to celebrate. Win or lose. You deserve it, Eliza smiled, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. Absolutely. The usual place in an hour. As she walked to her car, Eliza's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with James a few months ago. They had run into each other a couple more times since then. Exchanges that were cordial, if not quite warm. It was strange, she thought, how someone could go from being the center of your world to an almost stranger. At the bar, Caroline was already waiting, 2 glasses of wine at the ready. So, she asked as Eliza slid into the booth, how did it go? Eliza took a long sip before answering. It went well, I think, but with cases like this, you never know. We'll have to wait for the judge's decision. Caroline reached across the table, squeezing her friend's hand. Well, whatever happens, I'm proud of you. Look at you, taking on corporate giants, fighting for the little guy. It's like you've become the person you always wanted to be. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you, she said softly. Sometimes I can hardly believe it myself. A year ago, I was planning galas and worrying about seating charts. Now you're changing the world, Caroline finished for her, or at least trying to. As they chatted, catching up on life and mutual friends, Eliza found herself reflecting on the journey of the past year. The pain of James's betrayal had faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and self-discovery she hadn't felt in years. Oh, I almost forgot, Caroline said, pulling Eliza from her thoughts. And I ran into David the other day, James's old partner. He mentioned that James is thinking of starting his own practice, focusing on pro bono work, if you can believe it. Eliza raised an eyebrow, surprised. Really? That's unexpected. Caroline shrugged. People change, I guess. Speaking of which, have you thought any more about that offer from your old firm? Eliza sighed. Her former employer had recently approached her about returning, offering a substantial salary and a fast track to partner. It was tempting. A chance to secure her financial future and regain her place in the upper echelons of Chicago law. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to say yes. It would certainly make life easier. But then I think about cases like this one, about the people who really need help. Caroline nodded understandingly. Well, whatever you decide, I know you'll make the right choice for you. As Eliza left the bar later that evening, she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. It was a crossroads, and she realized, a chance to define not just her career, but the person she wanted to be. Meanwhile, in Michigan, Natalie Chen sat on her parents' porch, watching the sunset and turning Dr. Patel's offer over in her. The telemedicine program he had proposed was exciting, a chance to make a real difference in children's lives across the country. But accepting it would mean stepping back into the world she had fled. It would mean facing the whispers and judgments that had driven her from Chicago in the first place. Penny, for your thoughts. Her father's voice broke through her reverie. He settled into the chair beside her, offering a steaming mug of tea. Natalie took the mug gratefully, inhaling the familiar scent of jasmine. It was just thinking about Dr. Patel's offer, she said. Her father nodded thoughtfully. In the month since Natalie had returned home, their relationship had healed in ways she hadn't thought possible. The disappointment and judgment she had always felt from him had been replaced by a quiet understanding and support. It's a big opportunity, he said carefully, but I sense you're hesitant. Natalie sighed. I am. I love the work I'm doing here, Dad. The connections I've made, the simplicity of it all. Going back, even partially, I'm afraid of losing myself again. Her father was quiet for a moment, sipping his tea. Natalie, he finally said, when you were a little girl, you used to tell us you wanted to help all the sad children in the world. You've always had a big heart, always wanted to make a difference. Don't let fear stop you from doing that on a larger scale. Tears pricked at Natalie's eyes. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I make the same mistakes? Her father reached out, covering her hand with his own. You are stronger than you know, daughter, and you're not the same person you were a year ago. Trust yourself. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Natalie felt a sense of clarity settling over her. The path ahead was uncertain, but perhaps that was okay. In Chicago and Michigan, Eliza and Natalie stood at their respective crossroads, each facing decisions that would shape not just their careers, but their very identities. The safety of the familiar pulled at them, but so did the allure of new challenges and greater impact. As night fell, both women found themselves looking to the future with a mix of trepidation and excitement. The journey of the past year had changed them in profound ways. Now, it was time to decide what the next chapter would hold. The conference room of Harrison and Associates buzzed with nervous energy as Eliza and her team waited for their clients to arrive. It had been 3 months since she had turned down the offer from her old firm, choosing instead to start her own practice focused on environmental and social justice cases. Today was the culmination of their first major case, the toxic dumping lawsuit that had consumed so much of Eliza's time and energy. The judge had ruled in their favor, awarding a substantial settlement to the affected families. Now, it was time to share the news. As the clients filed in, mothers, fathers, and children who had suffered the consequences of corporate greed, Eliza felt a surge of emotion. This was why she had become a lawyer in the first place, to make a real difference in people's lives. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. I have some news to share about your case. As she explained the outcome, Eliza watched the faces of her clients transform. Disbelief gave way to joy, tears of relief and vindication flowing freely. When she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause and hugs. Amidst the celebration, Eliza's phone buzzed with a text. It was from James. Heard about the ruling. Congratulations. You've done something incredible. Eliza stared at the message, a complex mix of emotions washing over her. She and James had settled into a cautious friendship over the past few months, their shared history evolving into something new and unexpectedly valuable. After the clients had left, promises of justice fulfilled ringing in the air, Eliza found herself alone in the conference room. She looked out over the Chicago skyline, marveling at how much had changed in a year. The door opened softly, and she turned to see her assistant, Sarah, enter. "Ms. Harrison, there's someone here to see you. He says he's an old friend." Curious, Eliza followed Sarah to the reception area. There, looking slightly out of place in the sleek modern office, stood Mark Reynolds, the lawyer she had reconnected with on her first day back in court. "Mark," she said, surprised, "what brings you here?" He smiled, a bit nervously. "I heard about your win. I wanted to congratulate you in person and, well, I was hoping we could talk, maybe over dinner." Eliza felt a flutter in her stomach, one she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Dinner sounds nice," she heard herself say. As they left the office together, Eliza realized that this, too, was part of her new beginning. The chance not just for professional fulfillment, but for personal happiness as well. Meanwhile, in a small town in northern Michigan, Natalie Chen stood before a room full of expectant faces. It was the launch day of the Rural Telemedicine program she had spent months developing with Dr. Patel and a team of dedicated professionals. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the community center. "Today, we're taking a big step towards ensuring that every child, no matter where they live, has access to quality mental health care." As she explained the program, how local clinics would be equipped with secure video conferencing technology, how children and families would be able to connect with specialists from across the country. Natalie felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything she had experienced in her high-flying Chicago days. This was what she had always wanted to do, she realized. Not climb the ladder of prestige or accumulate accolades, but make a tangible difference in people's lives. After the presentation, as the room buzzed with excited conversation, Natalie felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see her father, pride shining in his eyes. "You've done good, Natalie," he said softly. "Your mother and I, we couldn't be prouder." Tears pricked at Natalie's eyes as she hugged her father tightly. The journey of the past year, the pain, the self-doubt, the hard work of rebuilding, had led her here, to this moment of clarity and purpose. Later that evening, as Natalie sat on her parents' porch, watching the fireflies dance, in the gathering dusk, her phone lit up with a notification. It was an email from the American Psychiatric Association, inviting her to speak at their annual conference about the Rural Telemedicine Initiative. As she read the invitation, Natalie felt a flutter of excitement mixed with a touch of anxiety. Accepting would mean returning to Chicago, facing the world she had left behind. But it would also be a chance to share the work she was so passionate about, to potentially inspire others to take on similar projects. Her finger hovered over the reply button, and then, with a deep breath, she began to type her acceptance. In Chicago, James Callahan stood before a small group of law students, leading a seminar on ethics in legal practice. It was part of the community service he had committed to as part of his journey of redemption. "The law is a powerful tool," he told the eager young faces before him. "It can be used to protect the powerful or to give voice to the voiceless. The choice is yours." As he spoke, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The man he had been, driven by ambition and the need for status, seemed like a distant memory. In its place was someone humbler, more aware of the impact his actions had on others. After the seminar, as he packed up his materials, James noticed a flyer on the bulletin board. It was advertising a fundraiser for a local legal aid clinic, the same clinic where Eliza had taken her first cases after their divorce. Without hesitation, James took out his checkbook. It wasn't much, he knew, but it was a start, a small step towards making amends, towards being the person he should have been all along. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the city, three lives that had once been intertwined continued on their separate but parallel paths. Eliza, Natalie, and James, each in their own way, were stepping into new chapters of their lives. The pain and upheaval of the past year had transformed them, stripping away false pretenses and forcing them to confront hard truths. But from those ashes, something new and authentic had emerged. As night fell, each of them looked to the future with a sense of hope and purpose. The journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and difficulty, but they were ready to face whatever came next, armed with the hard-won wisdom of their experiences and the strength they had discovered within themselves. 1 year to the day after the ill-fated anniversary party that had changed everything, Chicago was abuzz with excitement. The annual charity gala for the Children's Hospital was in full swing, transforming the grand ballroom of the Monarch Hotel into a glittering wonderland once again. Eliza Harrison stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile. As the lead organizer of the event, she felt a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. This wasn't just any fundraiser, it was her debut as a philanthropist in her own right, not as an accessory to her ex-husband's career. "Eliza, darling, you've outdone yourself," Margaret Whitmore gushed, air-kissing her cheeks. "I hardly recognized you at first. You look absolutely radiant." Eliza laughed. "Genuinely this time. Thank you, Margaret. It's amazing what following your passion can do for you." As she mingled with the guests, Eliza caught sight of a familiar face across the room. James had arrived, looking sharp in a tuxedo, but with a softness around his eyes that she didn't remember from their married days. Their eyes met, and James gave her a small nod and smile. Eliza returned the gesture, feeling a sense of closure wash over her. They had come so far from the bitter, angry people they'd been a year ago. "There you are." A warm voice broke through her reverie. Eliza turned to see Mark Reynolds approaching, 2 champagne flutes in hand. "I thought I'd lost you in the crowd," Eliza smiled, accepting the offered glass. "Just doing my hostess duties. Thank you for being here tonight. It means a lot to have your support." Mark's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. You've done something amazing here, Eliza." As they chatted, Eliza felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the champagne. Her relationship with Mark was still new, still developing, but it felt right in a way her marriage to James never had. There was no pretense, no need to be anyone but herself. Across the room, James was deep in conversation with Dr. Patel, discussing the progress of the rural telemedicine program. "The impact has been remarkable," Dr. Patel was saying. "We're reaching children who would never have had access to mental health support otherwise." James nodded, genuinely interested. "It's incredible work. I'd love to know if there's any way my new foundation could support the initiative." After his fall from grace, James had poured his energy and resources into creating a non-profit focused on providing legal aid to underprivileged communities. It was a far cry from his former life of corporate law and high-stakes litigation, but he had never felt more fulfilled. "James?" A hesitant voice interrupted their conversation. He turned to see Natalie Chen standing there, looking elegant in a deep green gown. For a moment, James felt a flutter of his old feelings, but it quickly faded. What remained was a genuine warmth for someone who had played a significant role in his life, for better or worse. "Natalie," he said, smiling, "it's good to see you. You look well." Natalie returned the smile, relaxing slightly. "Thank you. I wasn't sure if I should come over, but I wanted to say hello. And to thank you, actually." James raised an eyebrow, curious. "Thank me? For what?" "For waking me up," Natalie said softly. "Our involvement, as misguided as it was, forced me to confront a lot of things about myself. I'm not proud of what happened, but I'm grateful for where it led me." James nodded, understanding completely. "I feel the same way. We hurt a lot of people, including ourselves, but I like to think we've both become better for it." As they talked, catching up on each other's lives and achievements, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. The guilt and regret were still there, but muted now, overshadowed by the knowledge that they had all found their way to better versions of themselves. The evening wore on, a swirl of music, laughter, and the clink of champagne glasses. As midnight approached, Eliza took to the stage to announce the total funds raised. The number was staggering, far exceeding their goals, as applause filled the ballroom. Eliza's eyes swept across the crowd. She saw James and Natalie, standing with Dr. Patel, all three beaming with pride at the mention of the telemedicine program. She saw Mark, looking at her with unmistakable admiration, and she saw herself, reflected in the giant mirrors lining the walls, confident, purposeful, and truly happy. 1 year ago, this very ballroom had been the site of heartbreak and shattered illusions. Now it was a place of new beginnings and renewed purpose. As Eliza raised her glass in a final toast, she marveled at how life could come full circle, in the most unexpected ways. On a crisp autumn morning, Eliza Harrison stood at the podium of a packed auditorium, addressing the incoming class of law students at her alma mater, Northwestern University. "When I stood where you are now, over 2 decades ago, I thought I knew exactly what my future held," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I was going to be a high-powered corporate lawyer, climb the ranks, make partner by 35. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. But life has a way of surprising you, of challenging your assumptions about who you are and what really matters." As she shared her story, the rise to success, the comfortable but stifling marriage, the scandal that had shattered her world, and in the unexpected journey of self-discovery that followed, Eliza saw her own experiences reflected in the eager, sometimes anxious faces before her. "The law is a powerful tool," she told them, echoing words James had once spoken. "It can be used to protect the powerful, or to give voice to the voiceless. The choice is yours. But I urge you to choose wisely, to never lose sight of why you wanted to become lawyers in the first place." After the lecture, as students crowded around her with questions and comments, Eliza felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This, sharing her hard-won wisdom, inspiring the next generation, was something she never would have imagined for herself 2 years ago. As she left the law school, Eliza's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Dinner tonight to celebrate." "I have news," she smiled, typing back a quick affirmative. Her relationship with Mark had deepened over the past year, growing into something solid and nurturing. He understood her drive, her passion for her work, in a way James never had, and she, in turn, supported his own career as a judge, and offering insights and a sounding board when needed. That evening, over a candlelit dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant, Mark reached across the table to take her hand. "Eliza," he said, his eyes shining with excitement, "I've been offered a position on the federal bench." Eliza gasped, genuinely thrilled for him. "Mark, that's incredible. Congratulations." As they toasted his achievement, Eliza felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was what a true partnership felt like, celebrating each other's successes, supporting each other's dreams. Meanwhile, in a small town in northern Michigan, Natalie Chen was putting the finishing touches on her presentation. The rural telemedicine program had been an unqualified success, garnering national attention and numerous accolades. Tomorrow, she would be flying to Washington, D.C. to testify before a Senate committee on the importance of mental health access in rural communities. It was a far cry from the bright lights and prestige of her former life in Chicago, but Natalie had never felt more fulfilled. As she practiced her speech, her phone lit up with a FaceTime call from her parents. "We just wanted to wish you luck, sweetheart," her mother said, beaming with pride. "Not that you need it, you're going to be amazing." Natalie felt tears prick at her eyes. The relationship she had rebuilt with her parents over the past 2 years was one of the most unexpected and precious outcomes of her journey. "Thanks, Mom, Dad. I couldn't have done any of this without your support." After the call ended, Natalie stepped out onto her porch, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The small-town life she had once fled now felt like home in a way Chicago never had. She had found her purpose, her place in the world, and the peace that had eluded her for so long. In Chicago, James Callahan sat in a small, nondescript office, listening intently to a young man's story. The legal aid clinic he had founded was thriving, providing much-needed support to those who couldn't afford traditional legal representation. "Mr. Callahan," the young man said, his voice choked with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You've given me my life back." James smiled, feeling a familiar warmth spread through his chest. "So you don't need to thank me, Miguel. You did the hard work. I just helped point you in the right direction." As Miguel left, hope replacing the despair that had been etched on his face when he first came in, James leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Eliza, now a respected advocate for environmental justice, her name often in the news for all the right reasons. He thought of Natalie, making waves in the world of rural mental health care, and he thought of himself, no longer the high-flying corporate lawyer, but a man dedicated to using his skills to help those truly in need. The scandal that had rocked their lives 2 years ago had been painful, devastating in many ways. But from those ashes, each of them had risen, transformed into better versions of themselves. As the day drew to a close, Eliza, Natalie, and James each found themselves looking to the future with hope and excitement. The paths they had chosen were not always easy, but they were deeply fulfilling. Eliza, curled up on the couch with Mark, discussing their dreams for the future. Natalie, standing on her porch, watching the sunset and feeling at peace with her place in the world. James Ray, walking through the streets of Chicago, no longer burdened by the need for status and recognition. They had all come full circle, in a way, back to the idealistic young people they had once been, but tempered now by experience and self-knowledge. The glittering facade of their former lives had crumbled, but what had emerged was something far more precious: authenticity, purpose, and the courage to be true to themselves. As night fell over Chicago and the small town in Michigan, 3 lives that had once been entangled now moved forward on separate but equally meaningful paths. The story of the Callahan scandal had ended, but for Eliza, Natalie, and James, the most important chapters of their lives were still being written. And this time, they were the authors of their own stories. What did you think of the story? Leave a comment and a review about this story. If you were moved and enjoyed our work, feel free to help us continue producing. I invite you to click on our link in the first pinned comment. Now 2 buttons will appear, one to subscribe, if you haven't already, and the other to watch other interesting stories. Choose one. Thank you for watching this far. See you soon.